of these, but we help them to find their next level. And so here we are together, gathered for a next level small group experience with Allen Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church here in the city of Atlanta. I am Reverend Buxton. I serve as the pastor of these powerful people. So glad to have Brother Ron Allen with us tonight. And he is with us on a regular basis because he is our new Christian education director. And so as such, he has taken on the responsibility of leading this small group around the topic of social justice, God in politics, and race. Now, I understand that all of that is very, very, very touchy in the American society and globally. But the only way that we are able to see God lifted up is to make sure that we also talk about what affects God's people, and most assuredly through the lens of liberation theology. And so I welcome all of you who are here. Ronald Allen is going to serve as our facilitator again tonight. And I thank you for the panelists who have joined us. Our small group experiences began during COVID. When we all went about a year ago, and the thought about them came about, and now we just zoom in all the time, right? And so thank God that we can all be in our own spaces and still share tonight in this experience. One of my colleagues is on, Reverend Vandy Simmons, a man who is a social justice powerhouse in his own right. I'm glad that he has joined us for our first session, and thank you for coming back tonight. And for those of you who are joining us from your respective places, God bless you. Brother Thomas and Sister Bailey, Sister Jennifer, your internet's up, so stay strong. Brother Brian and Brooke, God bless you for being here, and Leslie, thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to pray and turn it over to Brother Allen for the evening. And this session is being recorded because we most assuredly want to be able to rebroadcast this for others who did not have the opportunity to be with us tonight. So if you would look to the Lord with me tonight. God, in the name of Jesus, we thank you, we bless you, and we do give you the highest praise. And God, we ask that you come now and rest, rule, and abide in this space. We thank you, God, that you have allowed us to gather to speak about a topic that is dear to your heart, and that is justice, social justice, God, looking at how we see you, how we revere you, how we respect you, and how we honor you in our politics and through our race. And so, God, we just ask that you come in this space, open up our hearts, minds, and ears, God, so that as the dialogue goes forward, that it might be enriching, not just for this moment, but it might be enriching so that we might leave this place actionized, mobilized, ready to see our community, ourselves differently, and to move our feet, use our hands, hear with our heart, so that we might hear the cries of your people and do something that glorifies you. In the name of Jesus, we pray. We love you. We bless you, God. And we say amen. Brother Allen, God bless you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buxton. Welcome to every single one under the sound of my voice. We are gathered here this evening as a conscientious group of believers, of concerned community members, because we are looking to maximize peace and reconciliation within our communities. And we understand that the God we serve has instituted many paradigms for peace and reconciliation between communities that have lived in conflict. And so we are lifting up the Hebrew Bible this evening as a manual to understand our roles and obligations to each other, not only as citizens, but as believers. We are going to be looking at policy and historical situations from the viewpoint of salvation. And how does the deity, the God of the Christian faith, define reconciliation in terms of power, in terms of economics, and in terms of identity? So we're going to have a three-part discussion this evening. The first part will be led by yours truly, in which we go on an overview of the God of Israel, Yahweh, and his view of reparations throughout the Old Testament. From there, we will go to a real life case study of what is happening in Asheville, North Carolina, between wonderful social justice groups and local congregations in the city of Asheville. We will finish in our third part with a walkthrough of ethical decision making with one of the most preeminent reparation scholars this nation has to offer. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. We will have question and answer portions at the end of the first and third sections. So please feel free to be as engaging and thoughtful in your inquiries as possible. To begin this first section, I will be sharing my screen, so I will talk largely from a PowerPoint. So if you have issues with seeing me, you shouldn't be seeing, you should be seeing the PowerPoint, even though I'm phenomenal to look at. We all know that. But with that said, let's go ahead and get started, because I certainly want to get us going on this wonderful conversation. So let me share my screen, and we should be ready to go. So this presentation is being brought to you by Think Twice, which is This Week in Christian Education here at Allen Temple. Reparations in the Hebrew Bible is one of the most topical conversations as we continue to define what is racial justice. In At the end of this presentation, one of the strongest outcomes I hope you all have is the development of a pro-reparations biblical language. That one of the great debates within the Christian faith is, what is the applicability of our faith systems to real life situations? And too often we get caught in the paradigm that the Bible is completely divorced from many of the long-term and generational issues that have divided our community. But upon thorough investigation, we find out that the God of Israel is actively engaged in the functions of his people as they relate to other groups and other populations within the ancient world. And it provides a dominating paradigm for us to understand how we, as multi-ethnic, multiracial believers in different class stratus, in different regions of the country, how we should be relating to one another today. So, like a lot of different believers, there is a theological paradigm that everyone subscribes to. That although the Bible is oftentimes presented as an objective book, we have found ourselves to be encapsulated in different camps. A large portion of the structure of this theological overview will follow it in the tradition of Howard Thurman, who makes very essential scriptural observations that are going to be very important for this discussion tonight. Number one, Howard Thurman, throughout much of his research and activism throughout the 20th century and his ministry, defines the ancient Hebrews as ethnic minorities within a multiplicity of imperialist states. That investigation of the Hebrew Bible sees that God's people are constantly intertwined with relationships with foreign powers, including the Egyptians, in which the children of Israel were enslaved for over 400 years. We have the Babylonian conquest. We have the Neo-Assyrian conquest. Different times in which the children of Israel found themselves in different forms of servitude, both voluntary and involuntary, and also Persian rule. So the ancient Hebrews were a group of people who validated the concept that the Bible and God himself exists within a political context, and that we must understand the historical and political context if we are to understand the mind and workings of the Christian God. Continuing on under the theological overview of Howard Thurman, that Yahweh, the God of Israel, makes a clear identification throughout the Hebrew Bible with specific classes of people. And I want to read to you all briefly from Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17, so that we begin to identify how Yahweh sees himself within the struggle of humanity. Deuteronomy 10 and 17 reads as follows, and I'm reading from the HarperCollins Study Bible. So if this is different from versions that you know, feel free to read along in the version of your own choice. And Deuteronomy 10 and 17 reads, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe." Verse 18, "who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves strangers, providing them food and clothing." Verse 19, "you shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." And so the deity's identification within the Hebrew Bible with the immigrant, with the stranger, with the traveler is irrefutable. And as we continue to discuss the Hebrew Bible, and by extension, the ministry of Jesus, there are certain precepts that we are going to have to accept as fundamentally true and irrefutable about the Bible that we proclaim to be the Word of God. Number one, the Christian story is an identity struggle within an imperialist social order. It is so important for us to understand as believers that the Bible, by chapter 4, is dealing completely with a social order that has fallen into the traps and the consequences of sin. That the perfection of humanity is so short-lived. And so understanding the particular social order that the Christian story activates itself in means we must accept political conflict. We must accept class warfare. We must accept a pluralistic society as fundamental into understanding the world in which the Christian story develops. That God calls Abraham in Genesis 13 because Abraham represented a lowly people, a people that was in need of a land, a people that had a difficult time finding a place to exist. And God himself reaches out to Abram and says that I will lift you and your seed as a sign of my greatness. And so we yet again see in Genesis 13 how Yahweh identifies with the lowly, how Yahweh identifies with the marginalized, and how Yahweh establishes his own glory by the uplift of those that society cast aside. That it is so important that we continue to relegate the Christian story around impacted people, because these are the people that Yahweh consistently identifies as those who are coming for his express purpose. Secondly, that a proactive social justice is a prerequisite for a successful relationship with the divine. That in addition to following the rituals and procedures of successful religious worship, the children of Israel were charged by Yahweh several times to live proactive lives of social justice, in which the wealthy were charged with the welfare of the weak, in which the powerful are elevated with the express purpose of leveling playing fields throughout the society of Israel. That to understand social justice as rolling in on the wheels of inevitability, to use a phrase from Dr. King, is actually counterintuitive from the message that Yahweh is trying to impart unto his people. And so we're not just talking about social justice this evening, ladies and gentlemen, but proactivity. How are you being proactive about creating the kingdom of heaven in your relationships, in your vocation, and in the institutions that you support? Continuing on, the theological overview of Howard Thurman equates private spiritual practice with that proactive public service and pursuit of justice. Howard Thurman does a consistent job in his theological praxis of outlining prayer, contemplation, meditation, even solitude as private spiritual practices that do increase our ability to communicate with Yahweh, to follow the rules of the divine. But we are also charged with public service and the pursuit of justice as powerful indicators that we do have a prayer life, that our contemplation has yielded our submission to the will of God by the uplift of our sisters and brothers who are the least of these. Lastly, when society comes to a place in which it can evaluate its disbursement of resources, when those disbursement of resources prove to be unequal, Yahweh establishes several divine principles of redistributive justice, of reparations, in which materials, income, property holdings are returned to people who had their property seized, in which we see a forgiveness of debts built into the liturgical calendar of the children of Israel. And we will begin to effectively investigate these biblical precepts starting in the next following slides. And so it's important for us to understand that the theological overview that currently dominates the nationalist religious narrative today, that continues to define poor people as lazy, or define poor people as not wanting to work, or not worthy of our consideration, actually flies into the face of very established Christian thought and theological principle. So let's continue on. Yahweh offers an ancestral covenant to his people, beginning with the elevation of Abram in Genesis 13. And Yahweh's view of salvation is really a three-pronged combination of certainly important elements that we must consider today as believers. Number one, religious fidelity, that Yahweh is concerned that his people adopt the values of idols, consistently conform to the theologies and philosophies of their neighbors. Many times, neighbors who are perpetuating much of the inequality that draws upon Yahweh's ire, that draws upon his anger. Looking at Deuteronomy 8 and the concept of religious fidelity, it's so important that we get a good, firm understanding of how Yahweh is defining religious fidelity for his own people. Looking at Deuteronomy 8, verses 17 through 20, this is what God says to his people. Do not say to yourself, again, reading from the HarperCollins Study Bible, Deuteronomy 8 and 17. Do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, so that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, as he is doing today. That if you do forget the Lord your God and follow other gods to serve and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord is destroying before you, so shall you perish, because you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God. The understanding of wealth and religious fidelity in the concept of Yahweh is very clear. It is spelled out in clear terms for the children of Israel to choose this day who they will serve. And because Yahweh made this promise to the ancestors of the children of Israel, ancestral fealty becomes an essential indicator for the continuity of the Hebrew people. That Deuteronomy 7 becomes a great understanding for us to be able to see how these impacts affect the religion of the children of Israel. Reading from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, you must utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, and show no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that will turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. And so we understand that a strong fidelity to the tradition of your culture, of your ancestors, becomes a way of maintaining your fidelity to God Almighty. That warning against idolatry and the adoption of the values of other people who live outside the covenant is a point of danger, is a point in which we must think twice. And so we see that the first two components of Yahweh's view of salvation will be both religious fidelity and ancestral fealty. But we cannot forget social justice. In Deuteronomy 15, these are some of the strongest covenants that Yahweh establishes for his people in the understanding of what it means to live in truth and to live in justice. And Deuteronomy 15, verses 1. In these scripture references, we do invite you, jot them down and go back and read in detail for your further edification, because for the time constraints of this conversation, we must be at a high level and cannot go in as much depth as we would want, as I would want. But Deuteronomy 15, verse 1 reads, every seventh year, you shall grant a remission of debts. And this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you must exact it, but you must remit your claim on whatever any member of your community owes you. There will, however, verse 4, be no one in need among you, because the Lord is sure to bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession to occupy. Verse 5, if only you will obey your Lord by diligently observing this entire commandment that I command you today. Social justice is a commandment. The forgiveness of debts is a commandment. The freedom of the enslaved is a commandment. And we see that the context in which Yahweh pledges that he will never break his covenant with his people in Judges 2 and 1 is contingent upon our obedience to this three-pronged system of salvation for Yahweh. And although Jesus comes to fulfill the law, I certainly challenge anyone to say that Jesus absolves believers from the express application of these three components as indicators of true
Mm.
discipleship and belief of the redemptive power of the cross. That if you invalidate social justice, if you invalidate the exclusivity of the righteousness of God, if you fail to identify yourself within the culture and the values of your ancestors, how will you be able to understand yourself as a true believer in the message of Christ and the value of Yahweh? These are elements that the faith must take seriously in this moment to re-enliven our faith walks. And so let's talk about the instances of reparations in the Hebrew Bible. And maybe from there, if you all have prompted any questions or concerns about how that applies to today, it will help us get into a very rich and thorough discussion. Now, I have outlined for you all three different scripture references of reparations in the Hebrew Bible. And these three references, in addition to more, make a very strong and outward biblical case for reparations for the Black community within the United States. That when we begin in the Exodus polemic, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 9, Yahweh is talking about hearing the groaning of his people, feeling the weight of the oppression from Pharaoh, because his people have consistently cried out. The impacted population here are the ancient Hebrews. That when you read the story of Exodus, that the children of Israel asked Pharaoh for 3 days so they could go out and worship, make sacrifices to their God. And Pharaoh refused. 3 days. Here we see that violation of any type of social justice from the powerful, that Pharaoh won't even give 3 days of reprieve to a people who have been enslaved for 4 centuries. And it is that type of unrelenting oppression that in verses 21 and 22, Yahweh establishes that he has given favor to the ancient Hebrews, that the Egyptians now hand over their plunder to the ancient Hebrews on their way out during the Exodus. That Yahweh promises his people and delivers on that promise, that they leave enslavement not empty handed, but they leave with the material requirements that are necessary for them to start their own lives. And obviously, that juxtaposes with American emancipation in fundamental ways, that we see that American emancipation made very little institutional retribution of resources and capital to African Americans, that largely African Americans were charged on our own to develop the societies, the resources, and the structures that will allow us to develop life for ourselves. A clear violation of Hebrew Bible principle and tradition under the statutes of Yahweh. Moving on to the New Testament, because I do want to provide some coverage that this understanding of reparations is consistent throughout the entirety of Scripture. We have the accounting of Jesus and Zacchaeus, in which Zacchaeus is a tax collector, an imperial guard, someone who is absolutely in charge of exacting the duties and the tributes from all colonies and provinces within the Roman Empire, particularly in his location. The impacted people, when Zacchaeus wants Jesus to stay with him, it's important to notice the language that he uses. That Zacchaeus doesn't say, I'm going to repay the people who don't want to work. Zacchaeus says, I will repay the people I've defrauded. I will repay the people I've stolen money from, which is a recognition yet again in the Bible that there is proactive thievery, usury, subterfuge coming from those in power, and that the way to absolutely absolve the debt is not some sentimental religious practice of being touched by Jesus, being made whole, and you make no practical amends for the life that you live, but that Zacchaeus actually paid 4 times the amount of what he defrauded from the colonies of Rome. This type of rebranding of the conversation is so important for what we need to do here in the Americas when we look at the banking systems that currently defraud people, when we look at the housing crisis, when we look at the eviction crisis, and we stop saying that people are losing their homes simply because they don't want to work or they don't want to pay. That even in the biblical understanding, the obligation of responsibility fell to the powerful. And that is what we also must enforce today as believers in order to get on the right side of history. Going back to the Hebrew Bible, and I'm going to have to speed up because I'm running over. I want to get to my other sections. In Leviticus 25, we see the establishment of the year of Jubilee. And this is a rule for Israel for how to govern itself. That when Israel approaches its 50th year, and we see this in Leviticus 25 and 7, 25 and 10, excuse me, that you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim the liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants, that the year of Jubilee does 4 things throughout the nation of Israel. It frees all slaves. Anyone who is indebted is freed. It is the release of all debts, the return of all seized property, and the fallowing of the ground, that we are to live off what God has blessed us with in the previous 49 years. This year of Jubilee becomes an interesting construct and for understanding how we as believers can begin to impose and recommend redistributive practices today. To apply this to the African American experience, this Hebrew Bible understanding, too much of the experience of African Americans as a result of institutionalized racism is described as hate. Like people just hate Black people, or white people are trying to execute hate against Black people. What we see is that the establishment of hegemony is very different from hate. And so let's go through a very brief historiography of institutional racism so we can try to understand how this is very different. Beginning with enslavement from 1619 to 1865, one of the biggest paradigm shifts we need to make is understand this enslavement as a very modern capitalist system. That the term money making money was really born out of the enslavement system. That the African body and the bodies of African Americans were the largest form of US capital through the antebellum period. That when we understand that African bodies and the wealth that African bodies meant to the United States economy in the antebellum period was greater than the value of all manufacturing plants, of all railroads, of all newspapers combined in the 19th century. That the bodies of African Americans were the capital in enslavement through which white landowners acquired property, built and acquired the supplies. And so we see this concept of money making money, that the value of African Americans in their own bodies then went on to produce finished products like the growth of cotton, like the building of the United States Capitol, and like so many different other elements that enslaved Africans and African Americans were able to complete. And we see this form of oppression as being very intentional, very forcible. It's very overt. And that goes from 1619 to 1865. Moving on to Jane and Jim Crow racial apartheid, this is one of the most misunderstood portions of American history. And it's where the institutionalization of so much racism happens. And when we look at systemic racism and look at so much of the elements that make up systemic racism, like debt peonage or the prison industrial complex, sharecropping, land dispossession, all of these have their beginnings and executions within Jane and Jim Crow racial apartheid, in which the United States government, state, local, and federal, actively just picked which rules they wanted to follow and left Black communities dealing with systemic systems like debt peonage. Debt peonage is a system in which if you incur debts as an unemployed African American after the Civil War, you could be charged with crimes of vagrancy. You could be charged with crimes of idleness. You could be charged with crimes of trespassing. And once those charges are presented to the court, we have employers throughout the South making bids on those charges, buying rights to those charges, meaning that the Black person now must, the Black citizen, these are US citizens at this point under the system of debt peonage, under Jane and Jim Crow, must work this debt off to the private employer who purchased that debt at the courthouse. This is a system that existed for nearly 100 years after the abolition of enslavement. This was a system enacted by state and local governments. One of the most appealing cases of debt peonage happened to Alonzo Bailey in turn of the 20th century Alabama, in which Booker T. Washington actually privately funded Alonzo Bailey's case all the way to the Supreme Court as he was unfairly imprisoned by one of the land laborers in the state of Alabama. Some of the other systems that Black communities had to endure during Jane and Jim Crow racial apartheid, sharecropping, in which African Americans who are looking to rent plots of land to support themselves enter into a debt with the landowner and work that debt off by the growing of their crop. And at the end of the harvest season, if your crop earnings did not provide a profit from the debt you owed to the landowner, then that debt was recycled into the next growing season, really making it more and more impossible for large classes of African Americans to gain institutional footholds in the United States. Land dispossession, another huge element of institutionalized racism, in which African Americans have their farmlands and ancestral lands that we were able to amass after emancipation eroded from family possession due to lack of wills, or absolute roving mobs of whites who would come and dispossess Black communities like in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, or throughout Red Summer that we see throughout the 20th century in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma. These are real policies that were happening and cultural phenomena that created systems that made it very difficult for African Americans to exercise their rights as free people. So we see the oppression that African Americans face in enslavement being intentional, becoming institutional in Jane and Jim Crow, becoming ingrained during desegregation. Because in desegregation, so much of the solutions for systemic racism, busing, voting, civic engagement, put the Black community in a position in which we must assimilate into white spaces in order to execute our freedoms. And coming up here in 2010 to the present, post-racialism, in which the type of systems that Black people are living through have now become invisible. We can't even understand our way of life as oppressive because we lived this way for so long that these elements have so been ingrained into our national consciousness that it's difficult to see life as we know it in the American social order as subjugation. And so I want to do a basic understanding of media literacy with us, as well as introduce to you all some writings from enslaved people, from the ancestors. If you have your computer up or if you have your cell phone handy, type in Google the letter of Jordan Anderson. Take an opportunity to read how this enslaved man, freed in emancipation, was able to calculate the back wages owed to him by his former enslaver. That Jordan Anderson was able to not only free himself, but maintain his own religious autonomy to connect his faith to the fact that he was owed reparations. And so, although we can't go through the Jordan Anderson letter in detail, the impact of what he was able to write in August of 1865 should still resonate with us today. And in the top right corner, I want you all to pay very attention to the media literacy triangle and apply these messages of the media literacy triangle to the lost cause graphic that you see in the combination of the KKK and the White League of the South. These are ways in which we have to understand how society was structured in America from the time of emancipation forward. That at the top of our media literacy pyramid, if all media contain value messages, we must try to understand what is the value message of this graphic right here. That this graphic right here was the emblem that was placed on so many flyers during the Reconstruction era. And right in the middle, we see that the value message for the reordering of American society was to create a condition for Black people that was worse than slavery. That was the point. And that the central target for this condition was the Black family, as we can see a Black family cowering right in the center of this form of intimidation. That we have to understand that flanking this Black family is a burnt schoolhouse in the back, in which the destruction of Black communities was something that was instrumental in being able to control the most basic economic unit of American society, which is the family. That white terrorists had access to the Black schoolhouse. White terrorists had access to the Black body, as we could see with the lynching portrayal. That this type of social order, in looking at the messages of this image, is to establish American government as a white man's government. In the wake of January 6th and the uprising we saw at the Capitol, the fact that we are going through conversations in which we fail to evaluate these images of history that continue to crop up really shows our limited approach. And so these are some of the symbols that were used generations ago to create a dominant moral narrative that it is the obligation of white politicians, white business leaders, because that's who the White League of the South is. The coalition of business leaders, political leaders, spiritual leaders, to disenfranchise African Americans, to terrorize African Americans, and to let us know that our place in society is to be worse than enslaved. So, with that said, when you have this history of marginalization, you have this history of double consciousness, the numbers begin to bear this out. That when we look at the socioeconomic condition of Black communities in comparison to white communities after centuries of institutionalized racism, we see that home ownership disparities are close to 40% as of 2012. When we look at socialization, that although Black home ownership has fallen in the year since 1976 to 2012, the high school graduation rate has actually increased. That what does it say that the more Blacks become educated in America's systems, that we have less of a foothold in terms of home ownership? That the more we're becoming educated by what America deems to be quality standards of education, we have increasing poverty levels. When we look at impoverishment, we see that Blacks are still more than three times as likely than white Americans to live below the poverty level. Same for our Latinx sisters and brothers as well. Lastly, looking at family wealth. Family wealth is most akin to generational wealth, what you will inherit. And we can see that the median net worth between Black and white families has increased since 1984, when these metrics were first taken, to 2011. That in 2011, the average white family had nearly 10 times the wealth of Black families. These are the numbers. And so we see a clear country in which there are two systems at work here. And the experiences of George Floyd and Dylan Roof absolutely encapsulate that in powerful ways. That as believers, for us to continuously deny that the experience of African Americans has been institutionalized is an abomination before the Lord. And so let's talk about where reparations are at today. There's a 10-point plan by the National African American Reparations Commission that is making formal recommendations supported by House Resolution number 40. Walking through some of this 10-point plan is number one, a formal apology, an establishment of an African Holocaust Institute, in which we begin to truly understand what are the impacts of the type of institutionalized oppression that African Americans have faced. That we have to do more than relegate racial justice to a civil rights bill or to a voting rights bill. That we have to structurally begin to rework this society in a way that recognizes the uniqueness of the African American experience, offers a formal apology, and begin ways to investigate how we can repair. Two, right of repatriation and creation of an African knowledge program. One of the greatest consequences for enslavement has been the denial of identity to the African American community. Us misunderstanding who we are. And that creates so many issues in terms of the development of a concrete people who are able to replicate their own way of life each and every generation. Number 3, the right to land for social and economic development. As we can see, the right to land for social and economic development mirrors many of the protocols Yahweh establishes for his own people, as Yahweh promises the right to land for the social and economic development of his people. For us as Black believers, we are also entitled to this right, both as a politically free people and as a moral people who are believers in the Most High. So we'll read through the rest because we need to move on. 4, we want to establish funds for cooperative enterprises and socially responsible entrepreneurism. 5, resources for the health, wellness, and healing of Black families and communities. 6, for community development and empowerment. 7, affordable housing for healthy Black communities and wealth generations. 8, strengthening Black America's information and communications infrastructure. 9, preserving Black sacred sites and monuments. We have Confederate sites in this country still being supported by tax dollars at the state and federal level. And we have had extreme difficulty identifying and preserving Black sacred spaces and monuments throughout this nation. Number 10, repairing the damages of the criminal injustice system that has literally profiteered off the forced incarceration of millions of Black bodies. So I'm going to stop sharing now, move on to the second session of this discussion, because whereas this has been a high-level conversation about the general history of African Americans, reparations conversations are going on at the local level in places like Asheville, North Carolina. And at this time, I want to introduce Rob Thomas, who I was introduced to maybe a little bit over a year ago through a college mutual friend of ours. And Rob is the community liaison for the Racial Justice Coalition, has been a fundamental on-ground supporter of the reparations movement in Asheville, North Carolina. Joining Rob in this discussion will be the Haywood Street Congregation Senior Pastor Reverend Brian Combs, who've been engaged with the Racial Justice Coalition and Rob Thomas on issues related to reparations. So I want to thank these two gentlemen for joining us today, having this conversation about how reparations has begun to come up in the city of Asheville and how their different organizations have responded to it. Rob, we'll go to you first. Please introduce yourself. If I left out any relevant details, add them in, and let the people tonight know what were the events that got you involved and your organization involved in the Asheville, North Carolina reparations movement.
Yes, sir. So my name is Rob Thomas. Again, I'm calling in from Asheville, North Carolina. This is also occupied Cherokee territory in respects to Native Americans. And so what kind of led up to my involvement was, a part of the slide that you portrayed as far as George Floyd. My organization deals, previously, our primary focus was police accountability, and we wanted reform policy changes around that. So we held community meetings with all community leaders on whether we would not officially protest or whether we would officially protest. Throughout this meeting, we discussed the strategy behind officially protesting, and we came to an agreement or consensus that we would protest, we would do so peacefully, and we would do it strategically as Martin Luther King Jr. before us did it, to use it as a platform to get some things done. And so then before we organized for 2 weeks, about a week and a half, about 10 days, we organized the protest. We rounded up individuals that we would have in place for bike marshaling. We created an agenda. We had different roles to maintain safety and make sure that the protesters and officers as well would be inside of a safe environment to where us as Black community members native to the area could speak our voices and influence change. Also, a outcome of this preparation was the creation of demands that we issued to our elected officials of what we wanted to see. And one line item on that was reparations. And we'll skip forward a little bit. Studied movements and protests and understood how things ebb and flow. The momentum builds up and it reaches a critical mass and then it drops off. So we wanted to take advantage of when that momentum reached the peak and center in on reparations, because this is a word that people don't want to speak about. People don't want to bring it up. It's a lot of emotions attached to it. It's a lot of fear attached to it. So it's like we're gonna wait till the peak. And we had inside, it's an inside and outside strategy. I communicated with Keith Young, who was a former city councilman, and he kind of tipped me off on like, hey, now is the time. They're weak, they're worried, and they're looking for for something that could be a solution for this. And he's like, and we're like, okay, we got to change all our messaging to reparations now. All of our protests have had to focus solely on reparations, and we need to get something that can put a placeholder on the momentum that we have, something that we can then hold our city accountable to later on down the line, because strategically politicians, the art of politics is simply prolonging a situation until it loses momentum. And then you can sweep it under the rug. So we knew what we were up against, and that is when we focused on reparations and messaging. We mobilized community members, and it was so much collaboration from the community that came into play as far as influencing our elected officials into signing on this document. At the same time, Keith comes out the back room like, hey, fellow councilmen, I got the solution. Let's do this resolution. And they were like, oh, yes. And they went in and I seen the rough draft, and they went in, they redrafted it. They actually made some things in it that made it a little bit stronger. A couple things that made it slightly weaker than what I first saw. And that's how we started. But we also knew that was the easy part. That was going to be the easiest part of that. Next part would be getting it moved from from symbolism to something of substance. And but yeah, me and Brian Combs got engaged a little bit later on down the line in a deal with the city where we were kind of on opposite ends, but we both identified we were working for the greater good. We stayed in communication throughout this whole time, and definitely saw how the systems that kind of put us on opposite sides of the line, and Mr. Combs, throughout that whole process, he was trying to figure out what a win-win to the situation is, and what he can do to help resolve the situation that he had been placed in. And he was basically going to be given some urban renewal property for $1 that was taken from Black people to produce affordable housing, which is definitely something that should be looked on in high regards. It's just the Black community felt sour about it and wanted it to be placed under the moratorium that we got issued on urban renewal land, and so that we could collectively decide what we would want to see done with it to address our disparities. Because taking of this land was a large piece to the disparities that you outlined so beautifully previously in your presentation.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that. If we can bring in Reverend Brian Combs at this point in time, because Rob, you really talk about low-income housing as an issue in Asheville, North Carolina. When we look at land dispossession, home ownership rates, we see that Black people are really facing significant disparities in terms of accruing the resources, bank loans, low interest loans, to purchase homes. Even when we look at New Deal policies and the creation of government agencies like the Federal Housing Authority, when the home ownership and middle class was created, it was federal policy to literally state in the language of the loans. We do not loan to Negroes. So Reverend Brian Combs, this issue of low income housing is real. Please share with us how the Haywood Street congregation began approaching its interests in working with different reparations commissions, how you began working with Rob Thomas, and where you all's collaboration is now.
I'm so glad to be here, Ronald. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you even more for starting with Howard Thurman. When I was at Candler School of Theology, that was the class that literally was a converting ordinance for me, and Jesus and the Disinherited remains, after the Bible, a seminal work for my soul. And so much of what Haywood Street is about was informed by that class I took with Luther Smith at Candler. So this feels a little bit like a homecoming, even if it's virtual. So I'm glad to be here. I want to introduce Brooke also. She is our lead storyteller at Haywood Street, and her role is to capture the voices and faces that so often get silenced in poverty. And also Leslie is our chairwoman for our Housing and Community Development Board, and we're glad both of them are there. For those of you that don't know about Haywood Street, we're a United Methodist Mission congregation in the homeless corridor of downtown, and our primary mission is relationship above all else, but that isn't just a wide embrace for anybody that shows up. That's a preferential bias towards especially people who are stuck in generational trauma, live in chronic poverty, have dual diagnosis with mental health and addiction. And we believe, according to Thurman, that it's no coincidence that Jesus showed up not as a prince, but a pauper, and that he loitered among women of the night, folks that were outcasts, lepers, and loiterers. And if the church is going to follow where Jesus went, then you have to go to the edges, the cracks and crevices of the urban environment. And that's where we locate. And if you spend 5 minutes with anybody in poverty, housing inevitably is going to come up. And we're 11 years old. And 7 years ago, we as a board decided that affordable housing was something that we felt called to by God. And here we are at year 7, and we still haven't broken ground, to give you a sense of how arduous this journey is when you mix politics, NIMBYism, money, real estate, urban renewal, reparations, in a tourist town like Asheville. It can take years to take one step forward. We started out pursuing Department of Transportation land, which the church is surrounded by. Didn't get very far with that. We tried pursuing the utility company, Duke Progress Energy, didn't get very far with that. And then the city created this map of all of their parcels, especially downtown. We approached the city 2 years ago about one site in particular on Ashland Avenue that's about a half a mile from Haywood Street, with a proposal to not just do affordable housing, but deeply affordable housing. Typically, affordable housing means what's known as 80% to 120% AMI, and that's basically workforce, which is educated folks who can't afford rent. That's an incredibly important group. But in Asheville, just like the rest of the country, the far greater need is for what's known as 30% AMI and below. So that's people who are well below the poverty line down to no income. And in Asheville, there's an interesting phenomenon that any given night, there's 500 plus people who sleep outside. And while 11% of the population of Asheville identifies as people of color, over 30% are unhoused. And so anything with housing, in my opinion, is going to automatically address many of the issues we're talking about that are precedents within Scripture. After we spent quite a bit of time and energy meeting with the city, engaging an architect, spending money on various pursuit costs, part of our research revealed that this plot of land was urban renewal. We didn't know that when we started all this. And a holy pause was put on the project for a number of reasons. And in part, that has been to do community-wide listening sessions. And one of the things I heard very early on from Rob, who's been so generous in his time and counsel with me, was that the reason this proposal is contested by some is around ownership, which is a entirely understandable position. And so we have brainstormed with other communities of color, nonprofits, about perhaps the land should be deeded to another group in Asheville, so that ownership is rightly returned to a group of people who was taken from. Also, we've been in conversation about a bias scoring metrics. Technically, you can't use race as a factor, but it's clear people of color are the ones in the last in line. I would argue Jesus always made a habit of loitering the back of the line. So we want to figure out how you move those folks to the front. There are a number of creative ways we can do that don't use race. And then as Rob talked about a little bit earlier, much of the Black business community has been gutted in Asheville. And a lot of that was along the Ashland Avenue corridor where this parcel exists, and a Black business incubator is something that came out of our discussions with the Black clergy group in Asheville. So we remain in this place of deep listening, this holy pause. As Rob knows, much of this process is actually out of our control. We don't own the land, the city does. And again, as you mix in politics and all kinds of other competing interests, much of the time, at best, we're sitting in the second chair, waiting on someone else's direction as to what happens next. But that's where we are right now. The city managers asked for an additional 2 months after the 3 months of intense listening that we did in the neighborhood and elsewhere. And I honestly don't know where this is going to land. But Rob and I talked a little earlier today, as we have many times, and my hope is that the many disparate groups in Asheville can coalesce around a shared vision for urban renewal, for reparations, and affordable housing. And one of the things I have said early and often is I reject the false binary that to support reparations, you have to reject affordable housing. I'm convinced both are possible.
Just a phenomenal encapsulation. Thank you both gentlemen for speaking so honestly and openly to your participation in the reparations struggle in Asheville. To put a nice bow on this, because I do want to hand this over to Dr. Nancy Bailey real quickly so she can really begin the process of walking us through some ethical decision-making recommendations. Where would you all like to, knowing that we as believers and you all as actual participants in the issues over this parcel of land do not have the power to exact a solution yourself, what do you want to see happen? How can faith communities and spaces of conscientious believers like this one begin to influence this continuing collaboration so that we get the desired outcomes that become a template for more successful collaborations on similar issues? Rob, we'll start with you and we'll finish with Reverend Combs.
Yes, sir. So I guess I'll start off with mobilizing the faith communities. Pretty much doing exactly what you just did previously in this presentation in church services, and teaching about the history and the biblical connections to what we are seeking today to address the disparities that we face in every system, and being able to create a common language among us as a people who have been disenfranchised from not only our history, but who we are as a people, and what makes us prime for a reparative framework to be introduced. Reparations is only a part and parcel under the umbrella of transitional justice. And for true transitional justice to happen here, there are several different things that have to happen. The overall concept of transitional justice is redistribution of power. You know, the land that Haywood Street's congregation was looking to receive is in the major scheme of what I am and many others here are trying to get implemented is small, but I devoted to fighting for every piece of land to be thrown up under the urban renewal moratorium, so that we as a community can then eventually come in control of all of the urban renewal land that is left to address the disparities that we face. And to also receive funding from many public and private entities, to whereas, for instance, anything is possible when you combine land and money. Any solution is possible when it comes to correcting our disparities. This isn't about materialism at all. This is about potential and tangible solutions. For instance, just one for economic mobility. The list of things that you named on your outline of what the NAARC, I think is
Yes,
the
sir.
acronym. That definitely coalesces with everything what we're looking to seek here. We're looking to go into 5 different pillars: economic mobility, education, healthcare, justice or the injustice system, and housing. And housing should not be left out of that. But for instance, a solution that is possible for just economic mobility. If our community could collectively come back into ownership of what was taken from us, along with a part and parcel of what is owed to us, we would be able to do things such as create a commercial development where Black-owned businesses can then set up shop and not have to pay overhead while their business capacity is expanded. Our Black youth in Asheville have no developments or anything as far as activities. That there are no buildings, there's no skating rink, there's no place for them to go to and kind of convene in safe environments where you have education and also appreciation of our culture. We are forced to assimilate into these white spaces that you named earlier. And our population is in a disparate situation. 10 years ago, we were about 23% of the population. Now here in Asheville, we are estimated to be around a little bit over 6% of the population. And there are several policies in place that, if you look later on down the road, those numbers are going to drop even more drastically if some intentional things don't be put into place. So, like I said, the whole reason why me and Mr. Combs were at odds in the first place was simply over the fight of not necessarily ownership of the land, but control and collective decision making over what happens to it. And this not be decided in some backroom conversations without the voices of those most impacted, or decided by quote unquote leaders, including myself. I advocate to empower the community members themselves to where all of their voices hold weight in controlling the processes that would seek to solve the situations that we are in. And so yeah, and you asked me what could the churches do? Simply mobilize their community members in the form and fashion, first starting out with education around the historical context of what has been perpetrated for centuries and how this equates to biblical ideology and theology, and how this previously played out in previous times, and what Yahweh did for his people to address these situations, so that we feel that we deserve these things. A lot of us feel that we deserve it, but also so that we feel like we have a possibility of receiving these things. A lot of us right now, because of what's happened historically, we've got these glass ceilings in our mind where something so massive and broad as us having control of thousands of acres and hundreds of millions of dollars simply to address our own disparities, like we can't even conceive that, because we've been stuck into this role where Uncle Sam and Father Government piecemeals a little bit of funding here and a little bit of funding there, and the disparities continuously get worse every year. We need some direct attention on our issues.
Just phenomenal. Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Rob. Reverend Combs, we certainly want to get your opinion on that, and then we'll certainly move directly to Dr. Ann Bailey for ethical decision making.
Sure, I would just share a few points. One is if there's a hangover of Trumpism, the list gets longer, but among the most concerning to me is the demagoguery and the divisiveness that remains among us, that if we have a difference of opinion or we begin from a different starting point, that somehow we have to immediately become adversaries. And I regret to say I'm watching many people in faith perpetuate that in ways that are so damaging. So I would say that to begin with. First, second of all, especially the mainline denominations, need to begin with an apology. In my own denomination, we had the central jurisdiction. That was a segregated conference that literally separated Black clergy and Black congregations from the rest of the denomination. That's a sin that has not been atoned for, and we got to begin by naming that through confession and then starting to work towards steps of repair. Finally, as I took a class on missions, Ronald, at Candler, one of the first things we talked about was Christian paternalism has to end. And the example after example that was given in that class is how especially the white church has globetrotted this world, especially into brown and Black countries, and said, we will give you Jesus and a well if in fact you convert to the way we believe God moves in the world. That has to end. And what I am proud about with our proposal is, rather than assuming we know what is best, we have listened carefully to many voices of color who have continued to encourage us to move ahead on this project. And instead of knowing what's best for the Black community, I'm going to keep listening. And these conversations with Rob and others are so formative. And one of the many celebrations I would name is our proposal continues to evolve. The more we hear from folks, the better refined it is. And again, I don't know where it's going to land ultimately, but I'm convinced the conversation matters and we're going to keep showing up for it.
Just phenomenal. Thank you all so much for setting up a real life context to bring in Dr. Ann C. Bailey, one of the most preeminent scholars on reparations here in the United States. Dr. Ann Bailey is professor of history at Binghamton University in the state of New York. She is also author of Weeping Time, Memory and the Largest Slave Auction in American History. She is also a board member of the National Black Evangelical Association. So she has both the theological, historical, social training to really walk us through some recommendations as believers that we can begin to use that will up our capacities and methodologies for creating situations or solutions to these issues. Dr. Bailey, you have been made the host now, so you can feel free to share your screen at leisure and begin walking us through some of your recommendations and analysis.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. And see if I can share my screen here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can? Okay, very good. Thank you very much. First, let me just say once again, thank you to Reverend Dr. Buxton. Thank you very much. On behalf of Allen Temple AME, I'm just, it's really a pleasure to join you this evening and to listen to this great conversation and dialogue and brainstorming as well, because even as I'm listening to this conversation, it's been very informational. It's also been, we're opening up a space to debate and discuss, and I'm very much for that kind of thing. So I'm really thankful. Also, Mr. Allen, thank you for the direct invitation. And also for the previous speakers, Reverend Combs, Rob Thomas. I have been wanting to know more about the Asheville experiment. So how great to hear from you directly. And I have some questions for you after I'm finished, but it's just great to pass the what's in the media to actually have some connection with you. So thank you very, very much. And to the others who are listening or who will listen to this conversation, I hope you will share it with others and inspire others to join this movement, because it is a movement. Let me just quickly say, I'm going to try to be a time that probably won't be much longer than about 20 minutes so that we have enough time for kind of Q&A and for us to kind of circle back to some of the things that you've talked about, and some of the things that I'm going to present on will connect, I think, nicely, I hope, to some of what's already been said. Let me just say again, I'm a historian. I'm also consider myself a storyteller. I am originally from Jamaica. but I'm a US citizen, have lived here most all of my life. And I do African, Caribbean, and African-American history. I look at history from a transnational perspective. And if we had more time, I would show you how this connects, which obviously this is mostly about African-American reparations. I do not consider myself someone who will be eligible. I want to tell you right now, I'm fighting for this purely from a Christian perspective, but I do think there is a movement for, and there is a movement for reparations in the Caribbean. And I'm also involved in that as well. So I want to put that on your radar because I think this is transnational, it is international, and there's strength in numbers. I'm also, I guess, a public scholar, and I do work in history and memory studies. And finally, well, two things, and I'm only mentioning these things because they might be things that you might want to ask me about later on. And so a little bit of this bio might be helpful. I am director of the Harriet Tubman Center for Freedom and Equity. And that's a center, research center, a new research center that tries to connect academic work to grassroots activity, very specifically to bring it down to what affects people on the grassroots level. And right now we're in the middle of our own truth and reconciliation process. We have a panel that we've assembled on my campus looking at race and ethnicity and how to, how to look at some of these issues that need repair. So I'm actively engaged in this on my campus. And so always interested in other models around the country. Last but not least, I am a Christian and I am a board member of the National Black Evangelical Association, which I think for many of us, what does it mean to be a Christian? It means, as you know, it means to be someone who's a follower of Jesus, but it also means to be someone, who's flawed and who's broken and who's in this world needing of repair every day and knows who to look to for that repair. So I say that because I'm not always able to say that as easily in every context that I'm in. And so how nice, how wonderful to be free to say that in this context and amongst all of you. Before I get to, and I want to share here, I want to start with these slides. Before I actually get to these slides, see if I can start. Before I get to our main discussion, which is reparations in the Black church or reparations and the church more generally, I thought I would read a little bit from my book, just a small amount, because really what I want to do with this session is spend the most time on what I call the rationale for reparations. And I think Mr. Allen has done such a great job in, I feel like it's such a beautiful, comprehensive job in looking at the overall picture of what's needed and why it's needed and how it connects to our Bible. And I don't think we can emphasize that enough, the rationale. And I want to say this because we need, in my view, to make the case. It's a case that we have to continually make because we need consensus. And I want you to think about that. One of my students taught me that. I've been banging on and on about reparations for many years. And just the last year, one of my students said to me, and you think our students are so radical and they're just ready to get out there and some of them are, but they're really thinking it through after a whole class on slavery and we're discussing reparations, said, we can go out and get reparations, but if there's no national consensus, essentially, there'll be somebody, the powers that be or others, who will basically shapeshift and turn what is a progressive thing into something regressive. Isn't that powerful? Young 19-year-old said that. Isn't that powerful? Stop me in my tracks. Stop me in my tracks. So it really reshaped the way I thought about this. So it's not just the accomplishment of reparations. Hear me now, we want that, we need that, and all of us are calling for that. But even way before that, we need to do everything we can to bring about some kind of national consensus, some kind of national understanding that this is the way forward and we're not going backward. And So I'm convinced of that. And I think some of what I'm sharing with you is in that line and going along that, with that in mind. And then finally, I'm going to share some practical and hopefully inspirational takeaways for you to think about reparations, and very much connecting to some of what you've already done. So keep that in mind. But first, if you will allow me, I will read a little bit from The Weeping Time, Memory and the Largest Slave Auction in US History, which took place in 1859 in Savannah, Georgia, not that far from you, about 3 hours from you. Just on the eve of the Civil War, the largest group of people of African descent were sold. And you might remember that Mr. Allen talked about wealth in bodies, and you may want to keep that in mind as I read. At exactly 11:55 a.m. on March 3rd, 1859, Dorcas, chattel number 278, was sold away from her first love, Jeffrey, a 23-year-old prime cotton hand. She stood on the auction block, motionless, emptied of words, emptied of tears. She spent the greater part of that cold and rainy Thursday morning contemplating their final separation. Now the moment came, and she stood as still as a bronze cast, her head covered with a beaded gray shawl. She stared vacantly at the auctioneer, who with one stroke of his gavel declared a death knell on her future. Sold, young Negro wench and a family of 4 to the fine gentleman from South Carolina at 11:55 a.m., bellowed auctioneer William Walsh as he pulled out his watch to check the time. He had a grandfatherly look with a soft pearl gray beard that jutted out above his slightly protruding chest. He wore a double-vested black suit with several well-appointed pockets, one of which contained a shiny stopwatch that hung from a short chain. Dorcas might have expected a monster of a man with blood-red eyes and a cold, cobbled face. Then she might have surmised unreasonably how a man with one stroke of the gavel and the stop of a watch could separate her from the man she loved. Jeffrey, a tall, strapping field hand with soft eyes, who was sold earlier for $1,310 to another master, pulled off his hat, dropped to his knees, and wept. Just the day before, he had cherished high hopes. As soon as he was sold to a rice plantation owner of the Great Swamp, he spent the rest of the day begging and pleading with him to purchase Dorcas. I loves Dorcas, young master. I loves her well and true. She says she loves me, and I know she does. The good Lord knows I loves her better than I love anyone in the whole wild world. Never can love another woman half as well. Please buy Dorcas, massa. We'd be good servants to you long as we live. We'd be married right soon, young master, and the children will be healthy and strong. They'll be good servants too. Please buy Dorcas, young master. We loves each other a heap. We really do. When his new master seemed deaf to his pleas, he came up with another strategy. Young massa, he said in an almost businesslike manner, Dorcas, prime woman, A1 woman, sir. Tall gal, sir, long arms, strong, healthy, can do a heap of work in a day. She's one of the best rice hands on the whole plantation. She's worth $1,200 easy. And a first-rate bargain at that. These words seemed to move his new master, who looked at him obligingly and indicated he would consider his proposal. He approached Dorcas with white-gloved hands and first opened her lips to check her age. He turned her around as if spinning a top and bade her take off her turban. As she turned, his white-gloved hand would alternately brush against her back and her breasts. He examined her limbs one by one and put his hands around her ample waist. Yes, these hips might be worth something. They might in fact breed a few children, all to his profit. He nodded approvingly at Jeffrey and agreed to bid on her the next day, providing the price was right. This was all the hope that Jeffrey needed. They would be together, he and his Dorcas. They would be far from home and family, but at least they would be together. They would be married, and they would create a new family. But when that hour came, Jeffrey's master did not comply. Had she been sold alone, he said, he would have raised his paddle for a bit. But Dorcas was not to be sold alone. At the last minute, Mr. Walsh had added her to a family of 4 to be sold as one lot to a South Carolina plantation. The thread that connected Jeffrey and Dorcas was undone. Dorcas was led away, and Jeffrey, who by this time was inconsolable, was joined by his friends. They stood in a circle around him, expressing no emotion, but standing guard of his. I share that with you as an example of the very human story that was a typical story, not an exceptional story, in the period of almost 250 years of enslavement. And in fact, the average enslaved person could be sold 6 times in a lifetime. They could go through that 6 times. We know a lot more about this auction than the thousands of other auctions, and we estimate that between 1760 and 1860, there were at least 1.2 million slave sales. Imagine that, 1.2 million slave sales. We know more about this auction mostly because this particular group of African Americans were from the Butler Island plantation estates of Southern Georgia. They were Gullah speaking. They were part of that African American community that was Gullah Geechee speaking, and people of, Southern Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And you can see there, it's hard for me to show you, but you'll see the words Darien there, that little town. That's actually where Butler Island Estate was, and the remnants of which are still there today. And so they had largely not been sold. And so that's why they're an interesting case, and they were an interesting case to study, because they had been more or less a settled community. They had come from West and Central Africa. Their forebears for hundreds of years had planted rice successfully in Africa. And their owners, or would-be owners, came to know that people from certain populations in West and Central Africa had this experience. And so they brought this know-how, technology, if you will, not just their brawn, what they could do with their hands and their feet, but what they knew, the knowledge and intellect that they brought with them as to how to plant rice. And so that on the eve of the Civil War, the men who owned these plantations, rice plantations and others, were among the richest men in America. They were like the tech barons of their day, like people who owned, IBM or Facebook or what have you. That was the equivalent. They were that wealthy, and they were wealthy because of what these enslaved persons, who, as I said, were sold in 1859, what they brought to the Americas. It's that contribution to the wealth of America. That's just one example. And nonetheless, in spite of all of that, they could easily be bought and sold. In spite of all of that, they could endure the hardship, the incredible pain of separation of families, so much so that they called that period, and they called that auction, the weeping time. And that's they themselves, which I always am so moved by, that they named their experience, that they wanted to be sure that somebody like me, somebody like you, would remember the humanity, remember their humanity. And so in this way, they put themselves in the history books, I like to say. So I'm drawing a lot from my work just to give you an example, more examples as to, again, the rationale for reparations. So that's the weeping time. Some of you may be aware of the 1619 Project, which is all kinds of things to be said about this. So you can ask me more in the at the end of the Q&A, but I was honored to have been asked by the New York Times to contribute and at first to write about the Weeping Time for them in the August 2019 project, which tried to capture the legacy of slavery and tried to look at some of these issues, such as, tried to look at the fact that in 400 years, where are we now, and what people of African descent have contributed. Once again, they've contributed so much to the building of America, but instead they've been left with an enormous amount of inequities and disparities in spite of important gains. So I was a part of that project in August 2019, and then the follow-up part of the project in February of last year, where I worked with the Times to identify as many sites as we could. I think there was some reference to historical sites and the fact that there's a big inequity in terms of our memory, right? Public memory and what we see publicly. Well, I worked with them to identify other places, other auction sites, aside from the Weeping Time, across the country. And so that's a really fascinating thing. We hope to continue that work. Much more needs to be done on that, because only 2%, if you will know this, of the sites of historical interest on the National Register have anything to do with the Black experience, 2%. So, this whole thing about Confederates, that's the least of it. That's the least of it. So, but obviously that's a problem. So you can see what an inequity and disparity we have there. So 1619, it was a good thing to work on that. I think the significance of that can't be underscored enough. That the 1619 represents the first, I would say, it represents the first enslaved, the presence of people of African descent in British colonial Virginia, the first consistent presence. So there were Blacks here before, but there wasn't a consistent presence that continued on to the present day. And of course, that changes and evolves into a system of slavery in the 1660s and becomes chattel slavery. And we don't see any let up of that until the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, which was pushed for not just by Lincoln, but by Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and others. So we've got, what we're talking about here is 250 years of enslavement with no compensation, because the Emancipation Proclamation did not come with compensation. It didn't. There was some opportunity for 40 acres and a mule, which I think has been widely discussed, that for a number of months, Lincoln gave his blessing to an order to compensate enslaved Africans of the very area that I write about, actually, in Gullah Geechee territory, to give them land, 40 acres and a mule, so that they could get back on their feet. But once he was assassinated, that was the end of that. Once Lincoln was assassinated, that order was rescinded, and people of African descent were now left, with absolutely, very little means to actually pull themselves up. And so what you had is that the white population had a 250-year head start, and then the Black population coming out of slavery were expected to somehow catch up, without anything in between, without any kind of intervention from the government or anyone else. Quite miraculous, I would think, and amazing to me that the people of African descent have done as well as they have, quite frankly, given the 250-year head start. I mean, that's not a race I'd like to be in, when somebody else is already close to the finish line and I'm starting at the bottom. I don't know how well I would do personally. So anyway, this is to say, is it any wonder that there is an ongoing legacy today? No, it isn't any wonder at all. And I think Mr. Allen has gone through, and also Rob and Reverend Combs, you've talked about, some of the ongoing legacies, whether it's housing, mass incarceration, all the rest. So I won't get into that, but it's no wonder, in other words, given these beginnings, given this historical background, that we are still, in spite of certain gains, and we must acknowledge that there have been gains, in spite of certain gains in civil rights, we are still living with a disproportionate amount of inequities and disparities. But now let's get to our faith institutions. And I think this is, to me, faith is kind of like the bright light. If the history of slavery is kind of like it's a weeping time, there's no question that it's largely a weeping time, and a series of weeping times. But in the midst of that weeping time, human beings have the capacity to have hope. They have the capacity to believe in something bigger than themselves and bigger than the very institutions that enslave them. They have the capacity to make music, as you know, and culture, and be a part of something which now globally affects the world in terms of Black culture. But certainly in terms of faith, I think it's important to note that this was a bright and shining light. And in terms of the area where I do some of this work, this is actually 1788, the first colored Baptist church of North America. And I thought I would note this because this is in Savannah, right? And these people still in slavery, largely, there's some free, but still largely in slavery, building institutions. And as you know, your very own Richard Allen, right, in 1787, 1 year before, started the AME Church. So to me, that's exciting, that under such pressure and oppression, they could build these institutions. Ought to give us hope. It ought to give us incredible hope, because how much more can we or should we do? To the right, you'll see that I have the New Testament. That's the Gullah Geechee Bible, which I think is just great. Very much resembles Jamaican patois, by the way, so I understand it all. And wonderful that this, this cultural, it wasn't until the 30s or the 40s that this happened, but it just was another example of the resilience of faith, the resilience of African-American faith. And so I wanted to share that with you and just remind you of your own heritage in terms of the Black church and the AME church itself. So let me close now. I'm closing now with some recommendations that I want you to think about, and some takeaways. For the country, again, I draw a common cause with what was shared earlier with the passages from Deuteronomy 15, where I think one of the prongs was social justice. And here it says, when you release them, the enslaved, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. And then the other verse that I stand on that I think is a message to the country is love your neighbor as yourself. It's so simple, really, isn't it? What do you want for yourself? Do you want good housing? If you want good housing, then you want that for your neighbor. What do you want for yourself? A good education? What do you want for your children? A sense of dignity and pride, whatever you want for yourself, the best that you want for yourself, we ought to want for others. And I think it's so encapsulated by that. Not only is there a biblical injunction in terms of the social justice injunction, do not send them away empty-handed, but there's also just the general process and way in which God commands us to interact with one another. As difficult and as high a bar as that is for me and for all of us, it is what I consider aspirational. So I think that's the lesson for the country. And I think it does begin with apologies. Apologies do matter. It begins with, there is discussion and brainstorming. And as I said, the attempt to reach consensus, the attempt to persuade. I know this is the hard way, and I know it's the long view, and I know it's the long run. But if you think about the history, and as much as I have lived and delved into this history, there's been so much one step or two steps forward, one step backwards, two steps forward, one step backwards. There's so much of that. You see, it's just like an ongoing cycle. It's like being in some kind of a treadmill. And why, I think, one reason is because this hasn't been a heartfelt decision for the country. Does that make sense? It's here. This is, isn't that what God, Jesus is really most concerned about? Is not the outside of the cup, is the inside of the cup. So if you think about that, it's the long view, it's the long game, it's the hard game, but that's, to me, and again, inspired by my student, really is what we ought to aim for, so that when we make that progress, that next big milestone, This is not something that we're going to have to watch like a hawk, because guess what? There are always going to be all these other elements trying to tear it down, change it into something else, and worse yet, use it as a way of division so that we're divided against each other even further, white against black and, you know, poor against rich. I mean, you can see it. Those of you in Asheville, you probably can already see some of this happening, right? So we can talk more about that, but this is something that I'm hoping that we take away. We realize as the church that this is one of the things that we need to be aiming for. In terms of practical things that I think the Black church specifically can do, I'm calling for, and I'm on record for calling for, an education revolution. I want to salute you folks at Allen AME and your Christian education program, also your College Prep 101. I noticed you have that. That sounds wonderful. Please, I think we need to, you know, the church needs to expand that. It has historically, as you know, been so at the forefront of educating our people when all those other doors were closed and there was no integration and there was no this and there was no that. You know, there was no getting into Harvard and Yale and all those places, right? Not because you weren't smart enough, not because you weren't talented and gifted, but because of institutionalized racism. The church was always there. The Black church was always there. Very often, as you know, founded by ex-slaves, very often. So I'm calling for just a revolution in education, and I mean that, and that happening on the local level and using the church as a site. Secondly, I think you need to look at your sites. You know, churches around the country, I've spoken to a couple of them, they're in danger. You're in great property. Your land, you're sitting on land that people want, right? You're sitting on places which are, you know, have high property values or what have you. One of the things that I've talked about with folks at the Smithsonian is how churches can think about getting historical designation, not just for their church, but for the community. So it's one angle to think about. And I really hope you'll pursue that. We are beginning to have more people of African descent and good like-minded white allies in the historical preservation business. And that's a good thing. And that's something to tap into. And then finally, continued advocacy on the local, national, and as I said, international level. I think church needs to be a part of this discussion of HR 40, right? And will this bill get any traction? Well, it's gonna get traction if parishioners and others write letters to their congresspeople, if they make phone calls, you know, the usual ways that you do in a democracy to advocate for what you want. I think that has to happen. And obviously work such as what's being done in Asheville should be enormously supported. Connections should be made amongst communities where we can learn from each other and help one another, support one another. I hope one of the things that will come out of this is that you will let us know how we can help and support you from wherever we are, especially given our digital advantage, that we don't need to be there to be helpful in many ways. This is my last slide, and I just want to say that my takeaway for the Black church and for people of color in particular is to think about, and again, this was raised, I think, very early on. Reverend Buxton mentioned the least of these, and that I so connected with that because this is one of my favorite verses, one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. I want to go back to the auction. I want to go back to those auctions, those thousands, millions even of auctions. And the pain, the devastation, the weeping, the abject horror. Even as I speak, imagine the person you love the most in your life, child, spouse, partner, what have you, being separated from you, perhaps forever. Even as I speak, imagine it now. It's horror. It is horror. It is an unimaginable pain. And it's not separation by virtue of death, which is the normal, natural way of things. We all have a time. it is by the arbitrary hand of someone else. And I want to say that I want you to go back to that. And I want to ask the Black community to think of that time of powerlessness and of weakness as a time of strength. I want you to get power and derive power from that moment, because guess what? God sees power in it. God doesn't will it in his divine will, but in his permissive will, it is allowed. And he sees his greatness in our weakness. And there is power there that I want to suggest to you, our Black community has not even begun to tap into that, because we're so afraid of that. We're running as far as we can. We're running so far. I want to be a millionaire. I want to be a billionaire. Nothing wrong with that. Be it. Enjoy it. Give some money to historical preservation and stuff like this. But very often, that's not what we want to do when we get there, right? Because we want to get as far away as possible from that pain, that trauma. It's totally understandable. So this is not a critique, but I believe in the work that I've done, that I believe that there is this power there. We can't even begin to tap into it. And it's like the sleeping giant that needs to awaken. You know, the sleeping giant, that the Lord can use this pain to tap into something happening in the world, not just our white brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, people around the world. I've had people interview me just the other day, people from the Middle East, you know, I mean, all over, Russia, you know, I mean, there's something about our experience that can heal the world. And I believe God wants to use it, but he can't use it if we don't go there. He can't use it if we're busy running away from it. He can't use it if we think there's another solution other than the very experience that has been so traumatic and so difficult, but necessarily one that we are now or moving to the other side. And we are, I think, perhaps such a great example of resilience. So I just want to leave you with that and say that there's a purpose to this pain. There's a purpose to this pain. And I think those who created many in the community who created those Negro spirituals, they understood that. There was a purpose to the music, there was a purpose to faith. And I think this purpose is to get out of it the power that we need to not only heal our own community, but repair the breach with white community, white churches, and as I said, people around the world. They're waiting. They're waiting for it. And I think they're needing it as much as anything else these days. They're needing what we can and should share. So I leave you with that. And I say, once again, thank you for, thank you for listening, and thank you for what you have shared with me today. I've learned a lot today. As much as I've shared, I've also learned. And I'm curious to hear your questions or comments and thoughts about how we can tie this all together and where we go from here.
So now this is the portion where we all can participate. We are now in the 8:30 hour, so it goes by fast, you all.
It does.
I thought 90 minutes would be difficult for us to fill, and we could literally go for 3 hours, I see. But we will respect the time. But if you do have questions, please unmute yourself. If you want to put them in the chat, I will be monitoring the chat to read them aloud. For our guest speakers, we are totally encouraged to give questions one to another or encouragement. So let me open that up at this point in time and offer the group a chance to relate to one another.
I don't know that I don't have a question, but I heard Reverend Combs, God bless you, man of God. I heard Brother Thomas as well, Dr. Bailey. It is very important because as I do other work with churches and how we maximize what we have even as our capital, as we are working with funders, as we're working with developers who often do not look like us, And the developers are seeking ways to sow into the Black community. They never have the Black community at the table. And so it is very important that our voices are heard, and they don't often come to the Black church, which has been very integral across our history in garnering. You all saw what happened here in Georgia with voting, right? The Black church is powerful, and so I hope that for those who sit in those conversations and continue to sit in those conversations, that there is a very integral and intentional focus on including Black clergy, historically Black colleges and universities who are in their own fight, but it's all our fight. So I just wanted to make sure that that is that we most assuredly lift that.
Thank you for that.
I do. I'm sorry, were you about to speak, Ms. Bailey?
No. You go ahead.
Yeah. So I have I guess something I pose as a question. With everything that you all have outlined, as far as how the Bible should produce a conviction within anybody who classifies under Christianity, no matter denomination, that reparations should be paid. Scripture that was quoted where, you do not send the slaves away empty-handed. Like, that's literally what happened to us. And for salvation of individual souls, I feel as if every church within this nation should be lifting up its voice in support of those demands and teaching its congregation of what has happened historically and why the need is there. And my question that I'm posing is, how do we get from where we are now to churches back in the lead of this fight? I've seen several churches, as far as activist work goes, what I put into the comment, several things are used to leverage them, where a lot of churches may not own the property that outright that they are holding space in. And so things like that can be then used as leverage to kind of create an environment to where they are almost afraid to go up against the powers that be. And you have a whole lot of other systemic things, such as money that comes from governmental agencies, and not only them, but money that comes from private sources, from people that are influential or organizations, to where they can also use that as leverage. How do we overcome these and get churches back in their rightful place? Churches, for civil rights, they were implemented to the change that happened. That wouldn't have changed without the organizing of churches. And where we are now, we're not going to get where we need to be without the collaboration of churches, plain and simple.
That's right. Can I say something about that? You're so right. And first of all, yes, I taught at Spelman for 5 years before coming back up north. So I can't say enough. Like, the historically Black colleges, the Black church, you need a seat at the table, and you have to, you can't wait to be asked, to be very honest with you. You really can't, because you won't be. I think you probably have a sense of that already. You won't be. You need to stand with the strength of your founder, Richard Allen. All these founders, when I go to these churches and I talk to folks and I just look at these buildings, I think, you built this? This is, to me, this is why I study this work. It's so inspirational. It's like, you did this under duress, and they couldn't have waited. They had to step out. So, because they will leave you out. You're so absolutely right. Or they'll only come pandering during voting time and all that kind of stuff, which everybody seems to do, right? But not when it's really the nuts and bolts of everyday things you have to deal with. So I agree, you need a seat at the table. And I think that if I can use the National Black Evangelical Association as an example, it's they were formed in 1963, thereabouts. And one of the things, it's Black evangelical, but quite frankly, it's open to all. And we do have Asian members, we have white members as well. It is a mostly Black organization, but it's very typical of that civil rights era that you're talking about, Rob, where, you know, you forge alliances. And one of the best things they've ever done is in Chicago, it started in Chicago, is that they have like a brother church and sister church, a largely white church and a largely Black church, which have formed, formed real alliances, like real integration, where they work with one another on different programs or what have you. Now, this was a few years back. Can you imagine if we started doing that stuff around reparations? Can you imagine, if churches, instead of being in their silos, you have what you do, which is great and wonderful, but you have a program that connects you with the leadership from one to the other, connects with a largely white church across racial lines, with other Black churches, obviously, but along racial line, across racial lines, to make this case, to make this very case. I think that's one of the things I think is necessary. I think there are more people who are willing to step up now than you may believe, that you may be surprised that there really is. I think with the right presentation and with determination, there are more people who are willing to listen, I think, than ever before, irrespective of what's happening politically, just based on the merits of reparations.
Absolutely. To piggyback off that, Dr. Bailey, I think in addition to mobilizing to gain seats at the table, we have to change the language and quit using a very sanitized general speak to describe our obligation as believers. The least and lost have names in this society. We know who the poor are. We know that many of our poorest families are single mothers, or we know that communities of color is not just some general term for non-white people. It's the Asian community, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who have just had their issues being brought to the forefront just yesterday here in the city of Atlanta. We know that the LGBTQ community have had their sexualities marginalized by the church for centuries. We know just by the ethnicity of us being of African descent, our hair, our noses, our lips, the way our resonance and our voice sounds, these are all things that distinguish us. And so this universalism, although it does have some merit in getting us to understand that we're all human, we have used it as a way to over sanitize the issues that we're dealing with and generalize ourselves in such a way to which the language is not even useful, or that the language is complicit in hiding the affirmative actions of those in high places. So we must use our voices and the religious language of the year of Jubilee as a standard of faith to say there are reasons to believe that this faith is useful and relevant in providing solutions to these problems. But with that said, again, we're over 2.5 hours. Let's go to final thoughts and comments from each and every. If there is nothing else, I do not want to cut anybody else off. If you have a question, get it in. If there is no question, we will go immediately to final thoughts. Let's go Rob, then Reverend Combs, and we'll finish with Dr. Ann Bailey.
Yes, sir. So I would like to finish off with stating, you've heard me use the terminology of Black and intentional about solving Black issues, and you may think that this is divisive or separatist thinking, but I would like to take this time to expand your perspective and way of thinking to whereas solutions to our disparities benefits all people. The cost of racism every year is estimated at 16. Since 2000 to right now in 2021 is estimated to have cost us $16 trillion over this time. If racism was ended tomorrow, it has been estimated by economists who study this type of stuff that $5 trillion would be produced within 5 years of stimulus to our economy. Also, ending the generational gap alone is estimated at 12 to 14 trillion dollars, right? So if this was alleviated, our economy, our GDP, gross domestic product yearly, would increase over $5 billion annually within 4 years. If a lot of the disparities are cut out within the criminal justice system, it makes a safer environment for everybody. If you increase resources to the people that are most vulnerable and most impacted by the decisions that are made at the top, it creates a better environment for everybody. You have less people committing crimes. You have more business owners, meaning more employment, meaning a more robust economy. You have social cohesiveness forming because you now are alleviating oppression on multiple levels, and you are talking about true racial healing throughout a nation. So what I focus on, even though you hear me speak solely about the demographic that I come from, just know that everything that I'm saying benefits all people.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, it benefits all people.
It sure does.
Thank you so much, Rob. Again, this
Sure
is Robert
does.
Thomas of the Racial Justice Coalition. He's community liaison for the Racial Justice Coalition in Asheville, North Carolina. Rob, tell everybody how they can be in touch with you, or they can find you on social media, and now we'll move on to Reverend Brian Combs.
Yes, sir. So you can check out my website at rjcavl.org. Again, that's rjcavl.org. Instagram is Racial Justice Coalition AVL. Facebook is Racial Justice Coalition Asheville. And yeah, if you reach out through the website, there's plenty of ways to get involved. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so everybody's in Zoom land, so it doesn't matter if you're in Alaska. You can get involved with our work. We have several volunteer teams, and volunteer teams is the lifeblood of our organization. That's where the work gets done at. That's where the communications come together. That's where the campaigning starts. That's where the mobilizing of community members happens. So we've always got an open door to help us create a better future and environment for all people.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's just been a pleasure working with you over this last year plus. We got to this point. Can't wait to see where God takes us next. Reverend Brian Combs, Senior Pastor for Haywood Street Congregation. Please share any final thoughts with us and let us know where we can reach out to further contact you and learn about Haywood Street Congregation.
Ronald, thank you again for the invitation. haywoodstreet.org is our website. Feel welcome to learn more about who we are. And rather than a final comment, Dr. Bailey, I'd like to ask you a question. Since we found out this site was part of Urban Renewal, I have felt like I have been planted back in a Christian ethics class. And for me, it feels like there's an akin conversation to where you land on just war theory. Was Bonhoeffer's assassination attempt a loving act towards Hitler? For me, this has been a crisis of conscience in many ways, to try to figure out where my moral compass is, understood through a Christian lens about what to do or not to do. And my question is, in all of my listening, what I have found, and I suspect this is somewhat reductionistic, but I can only go on the sample size that I've been allowed to engage with different voices about, is it seems in Asheville that the older and the more Christian and the blacker the voice, the more in support of affordable housing on this site there is. And the younger, more secularist voice, the more opposed. And I understand this conversation the Black community is having with itself in Asheville is a long-standing lover's quarrel of sorts. And if in fact consensus is where we are called most by the Spirit to move towards, how do we as people of faith help facilitate that conversation? And that may mean that our project needs to move to another site, or it may mean that it's reimagined with different partners at the table. But I'm just curious, Dr. Bailey, what counsel would you give Leslie, Brooke, and I about building consensus in this moment?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because there was something I was a little confused about in the presentation between you and Rob. Were you the party, was Haywood Street the party that was originally offered $1 for the land? You would give $1 and you'd get the land and then you could develop it. Was that, or was it some other developing agency? I mean, you're the church, but were you a part of that? Does that make sense? Did I understand this correctly? Correct me.
Yes, what the city of Asheville did is they created this map of all their parcels, and we approached the city with a proposal.
Okay.
And part of that discussion ended with the city saying, we would deed this property to you all, Haywood Street Community Development, for $1, because if you're going to do deeply affordable housing, you can never afford to pay full market value for the land, because you're going to ultimately build something with very modest revenues.
Right. So, and the church that's this development arm, is a development arm of your church. Is
Correct.
Am I understanding? Okay. And so part of the controversy is, as you said, it's working, it's depending on demographics. Is that what's happening? Depending on the demographics, depending on whether they're people of faith or they're not people of faith. Is that how it seems to be splitting in terms of their interest in the, support for the project?
What I've said from day one is I don't speak for the Black community, but I listen very carefully. And there have been, again, in my discussions, older, more Christian voices in support of the proposal, and younger, more activist, secular voices in opposition. And I don't believe that's actually the truth, but of the people I've talked to, that's tended to be the way it's broken down.
Okay, I'm coming to answer your question. I'm just getting more information.
That's a great question, and I'd be curious if Rob agrees with that.
Yes, Rob, would you share as well? This is happening in Christian community. So I'm really happy that's what we need to do, is talk, right? What do you say?
Yeah. I would say I agree with most of that. I would just one thing, because you give me a definition, your definition of the word secular, please.
I would say secular is I'm defining it, is not someone who grew up in the Black church, does not identify as Christian. By secular, I don't mean that they affirm some higher power, but not explicitly tied back to the Black church.
Okay, I am explicitly tied to the Black church, whereas my grandfather was a reverend here, James Baxter. My grandmother then took over and used to hold church services in our living room as growing up. I was raised in Christianity. I myself am a believer in Yahweh, and I know Jesus is Yeshua and respect him in those regards, whereas I don't conform to the white ideology of Christianity as far as the race of him, but I don't want to have a theological debate, but I wouldn't consider myself as a secular individual, whereas I study the word of the Bible and believe that all words within that book are true and should be applied to life in every context. It's just when you get to categorizing yourself, you fall into the traps of traditionalism. And I believe that traditionalism is a huge issue within our religious institutions of today. And that is the major issue that causes a major problem of divisiveness and division within our religious communities, to where we do not come together for the greater good of all humanity. So I don't view myself as secular, and I don't view a lot of the individuals as secular. But also, I disagree. I am in communication with a whole lot of youth pastors and some of the elder pastors as well, such as Robert Zachary, who is definitely a internationally well-known reverend, and he disagrees with the development, and several others. I can continuously name.
Okay. So just to be clear, the Racial Justice Coalition is not in favor of the project moving forward. Is that the particular stance at the moment? Just to
not on this land. It is
not
a
on
great
this land.
project.
Okay.
And,
Great project, but wrong place. Okay.
Yes, he's an honorable man for constructing this, but it needs to be this. Okay, the underlying ideology is urban renewal land is some of the only land that Black people have something. Yeah, I wouldn't say access. We have a right to getting this land back. This is the land this is the path to least resistance for us. Whereas Mr. Combs has resources, and he can literally get land anywhere else. The city has thousands of acres. Now they may have disclosed to him that that this was the only spot that they're willing to give, and that's because they received the land for so cheap. But they literally have thousands of acres that the same project could be done on. I also understand the accessibility to the downtown area to Mr. Combs, but this is some of the only land that us as Black people in this town have the right to say that this should be going back to us. So I will fight tooth and nail for every acre of this land.
I would say, without knowing more details, but just on the face of it, and I think you said so, Reverend Combs, yourself too, you said that one of the things you wanted to do was to listen very closely to as many people as you could, right, in the Black community about how they feel about this particular project. It sounds like, without a doubt, it's obviously the project in and of itself to have low income housing is a wonderful project. But I would definitely encourage you, because, one of the things that the Lord has taught me, and I'm still learning, is that, and he says it to me all the time, he says, it's the how, not just the what. Because, I'm very driven by my goal oriented, it's a good goal. It's a worthy goal and I got to get there. And in my life, he's backed me up a lot of times and says, but it's how you get there, Ann. It's all about the how. I'm all about the how as well as the what. And it gives me pause, So I'm not saying yay or nay. If that says anything to you, I'm just, because I couldn't weigh in on something that I haven't had more detailed conversations about. But if there is a conflict, and clearly there is, and perhaps also one thing that is concerning, if it's true that there are these kind of what we would call almost like sweetheart deals for a church community that is concerned about inequities, you got to think about that, because it's very rare that Black entities get offered, if that's true, 0 interest loans or $1. It just almost never happens. But I've actually hear, and you're concerned about that, because I know you are, because you care about the Black community. So those are things I would be thinking about, because I do hear these stories like this, and they're not necessarily always with conflict issues where there's things of contestation, but the only time I've ever heard of things given like $1 is when there is an entity that's white asking for it, even if it's for a good cause. Does that make sense? And we have to kind of wonder about some of the motives of the people behind some of these urban renewal projects. So I just want to, again, I'm not ascribing anything, vicious to anybody, because I don't know the people involved, but it's a pattern across the country. So it's not just Asheville. Does that make sense? It's not just Asheville, it's across the country. I encourage you to see a documentary called Flag Wars, if you haven't seen it already. And I think it would be just important to see it. So you see, again, it's about another community, and they were dealing with some of these types of issues. But at the same time, I want to encourage your heart. You've got your heart's in the right place. God knows, we can see it. We can see your heart. It's in the right place. And pray, seek God, seek the Lord, seek him deeply, deeply, so that you are sure that you're sure that you're sure that you know that you know that you know that this is the direction you want to move ahead. Because again, you want, I think you ideally you want to bring the community along with you. Ideally, that would be ideal, right? I mean, I think that's your heart, right? If you're interested in reparations and you're committed to reparations, you don't want to further divides, you want to bridge divides. So talk, listen, hear more, and seek the Lord is what I would say. Seek him deeply, deeply. The how, not just the what. I can't tell you. There are things that I've done that I've had to wait years before they came to fruition, because God said, wait till it was done in his way, his timing. And I am probably standing before you now because I waited, or because he made me wait.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bailey. And I do want to say, if you all, we are undergoing that very same thing here in Atlanta.
Are you?
If you've heard that Microsoft is coming to Atlanta,
There you go.
right?
There
So
we go.
they're building their eastern headquarters, and they have purchased land in an area that is reurbanizing, that has been allowed to fall into blight, so that it will, and that's where our church is, right? So there are hundreds of acres over here. 90 of them Microsoft has purchased, but our mayor did a moratorium on, because I heard you say that, Brother Thomas. Our mayor did an urban renewal moratorium as well on building in this area. But isn't it interesting that it was lifted because Microsoft was coming, right? And Microsoft is not received, and the Black community now, I mean, land that we just purchased land in this area for $10,000. We just got blessed.
Right.
It was worth 310 when we bought it.
Right.
But land in this area is now going for upwards up to $1 million an acre. Right?
Yeah.
What person in this area where we have
Would ever afford
8%
that?
home ownership, 8% home ownership in a predominantly Black, historically Black legacy neighborhood, all of the neighborhoods around here. This is right where the Georgia Dome was built. I mean, where the new Mercedes-Benz Stadium was built. What person, even legacy residents, will be able to remain in this area now?
That's right.
And so there have to be corporations who have the resources, who have the same heart as I hear you sharing, Reverend, who say, okay, this is what we want to do, but I'm not going to be the face of it. I'm going to support it, but I'm going to support it from behind, so that others who should be able to, who have been in this community, are then able to remain in the community by doing land trust, trusts, and
that's land trust,
so that you cannot do anything with this land, and perhaps that might be a means to say this is going to be land trust. This is going to be a trust right here.
Right.
What we're given from the city, every time we're given something from the city, it's going to be a trust.
That's right. That's right.
And so those are things that we're looking at with developers, because there is a power there that comes with the land ownership and the money and the means, and with every bit of power there comes a responsibility.
That's right.
And so
we're
all wrestling with that. So when Dr. Bailey says it's happening all over the country, it is happening right in my neighborhood
backyard
now. Absolutely. So I thank you all for tonight. I realize that we could go on, but I'm going to cut Mr. Allen off right now. Guess what I'm getting ready to do, Pastor? I'm going home. And we're all going to go home. Reverend Allen, God bless you. If you would like to give us our closing, closing words and a prayer.
Absolutely. With that said, again, as conscientious believers, we have to be encouraged to be nonconformists. That if the powerful, if the elites, if the evildoers are scratching their heads by the decisions that we make as believers, we're on the right track. But if the power brokers are patting us on the back and letting us know that we've done things that are similar to what they want, that's going to be a powerful indicator that we have lost our salt as believers and that we are being trampled upon. So with that said, we cannot be afraid to break new ground. This has been such a wonderful discussion. It can last forever, as Dr. Bailey and Dr. Buxton has said, but we pray that it has been enlightening, and we pray that God bless us, that God keeps us, that God makes his face shine upon us, be gracious unto us, and give us peace. And if, Lord our God, if you bring us back here to the appointed place at the appointed time, we will be ever so careful to give your name all the praise, the honor, and the glory. So feel free to connect with Allen Temple at www.allentempleatlanta.org. And we will be putting up a recording of this broadcast for you all to share with your local organizations. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you all so much, and
pleasure.
be blessed.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.